Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Let's just begin by considering from a theologian's or a Sharia student's perspective the applicability of the specific Western, ultimately Latin word education when transplanted into the rather different spiritual and intellectual landscape of Islamic thought. There's a well-known dispute over its etymology. When we say education, from the Latin ex duco, what is the significance? And if we ever dust down the covers of our Latin dictionaries, remembering perhaps unhappy aspects of our school days, we'll find that, in fact, there's different rival definitions. At the basis of this mustalah, there is a dispute over what the idea of education is supposed to mean. Is it about a process of inculcation from without, or is it ex duco, bringing out from within? What is the educator's task? Already there's an ambiguity in the very word itself, in the name of this distinguished department and this entire burgeoning academic discipline. So in our world we would say, is the Muslim educator's task primarily one of supplying education or information guided by obvious Islamic theocentric presuppositions, or one of nurturing and cultivating a virtuous form of life and a religious nature which are already ultimately there in homo religiosus or in the fitra? Evidently, in any Muslim pedagogic process, both are going to be involved to one extent or another. One inputs, but also allows the child to grow. But locating the balance between this educational input and introspective discovery is notoriously a tricky task. In addressing this question, what I'm going to do is to offer some reflections on the significance of that aspect, that instrument of the human composite of Bani Adam, which is most directly involved in these processes of inculcation or of drawing out, which is to say, the aql. I want to turn this into an opportunity for considering the Islamic educational repercussions of this ultimately scriptural term. Often we translate it as intellect or reason, and that may be as problematic as introducing the word education into an Islamic context. Not inherently illegitimate, but one that requires a certain careful scrutiny of intention and direction. And this is going to enable us, I hope, to entertain, at least begin to entertain, the underlying question, implicit in the paradox of the word itself, as to whether Islam ought to be seen by its educational theorists as essentially a religion of reason or of inspiration. Let's say that this argument of what education is in our context part of a larger argument over what sort of religion we have. Is Islam mainly a religion of the brain, or is it mainly a religion of the heart? And on this issue hang very significant, even foundational guiding issues for pedagogy and curriculum design in the modern context. Muslim theologians have often wished to champion our revelation as a supreme advocate of reason, seen as a God-given objective canon and method which enlightens an otherwise ignorant, jahil, human self. It is aql that takes us out of ignorance and what distinguishes us from all other levels of creation. God's word, speech, nutq, is said to be the very ground and guarantor of logic, mantiq, which is the armature, as it were, arithmetical form of the due process of argumentation and syllogistic proof, which is the basis of the reasoned use of the human brain. And it's true that our book does present itself as a series of divine arguments that are readily accessible to the mind. And in modern and modernist Muslim discussions about education, this theme has been regularly ratcheted up dwelt on almost ad nauseam, as these discussions, as we have them today in the modern Muslim conversation about education theory, have developed from 19th and 20th century apologetics, which occupied a space which was more or less anti-Christian and anti-Western, which were concerned to defend the integrity of the revelation as a quintessential appeal to man's aql. This was part of the 19th, 20th century apologetic agenda. So let's read Rashid Rida, who else to turn to in these definitional matters, as an example of someone who is inhabiting that strongly anti-colonial space, but developing a fertile theory and a reconfiguration of ways of defining our relation to Scripture. So he says, this is in his bit of the Tafsir al-Manar, read through a biblical concordance and you will never find the word intellect or any synonym for this human faculty which raises human beings above the entire animal kingdom, whether it be insight, lub, or noha, intelligence. This is because this category is never mentioned in either the Old or the New Testament, since it's not a basis for the understanding of their religion and its arguments and lessons. Neither is the Bible's religious discourse religiously oriented or based on reason. Similarly absent are the words thinking, tafakkur, contemplation, tadabbur, and looking at the world, all of which are amongst the greatest functions of the intellect. By contrast, the intellect is referred to approximately 50 times by name in the Noble Quran. The phrase people of insight, ulul albab, which is to say people of intellect, that's how Rida is determining that, appears more than 10 times, while people of discernment, ulul noha, is also to be found once at the end of Surah Taha. Furthermore, these Quranic references mostly apply to Allah's signs, ayat, and to the fact that those who are addressed by them, who understand them and receive guidance through them, are the intelligent, al-uqala. Most of these verses pertain to the physical universe, which point to Allah's knowledge, will, wisdom, and compassion. It's quite characteristic of the way in which 100 years ago Muslims sought to defend the integrity of the Scripture against the then Islamophobic global or Western colonial discourse. These polemics were very specifically reactive against a current European belief in Oriental unreason, which imperial discourses were propounding as an explanation for the East's status as a mass of backwardness and unknowing, ripe for Western uplift and discipline. Ernest Renan died in 1892. Remember him as the famous adversary of Afghani, one of the first ever public formal debates between Islam and modernity. Renan, riding the warhorse of European triumphalism, influentially attacked Islam as being essentially a kind of militant Judaism. Jews on horses, that's his understanding of what Muslims are, describing it as an irrational legalism which rejected the spirit of reason and needed to be fought without mercy. And it was this atmosphere of fierce polemic that sharpened the characteristic modern Muslim apologist retort that Islam is in fact quintessentially reasonable. It's a rational religion, it's a logical, reasonable religion. The Quran is a text of logical induction, a view which among some believers also at the time drew some mileage from a rising polemic against Sufism. The reaction against Sufism amongst modernists in that period was often derived from the fact that they thought Islam was a religion of reason, and so inspiration and mystical dreams and experiences didn't really fit this new recalibrated vision of Islam's proper self-definition. And Ali Bulach and other Muslim writers have dominated the recurrence of this Islam equals rationality trope as perhaps the most recurrent theme in the apologetic motif in 20th century Islam in Turkey, but very generally. Indonesia would be another good example. India would be another good example. The tradition of Maulvi Chiragh Ali, Sir Said Ahmad Khan, and those who wanted to push back against the Orientalist missionary conviction that Islam was a mass of unreason by pointing to the rationality of the Quran's arguments over and against the Bible's apparently incoherent mass of conflicting stories. And today, in the Western milieu, it is presumably significant that a significant number of converts also claim that they have been attracted to what they take to be the religion's clear, rationally accessible teachings, said to be unobscured by elaborate mysteries. But it's not only insiders who want to take this view. non-Muslim academic accounts, which have largely left Renan behind. I mean, Renan's voice is there, but it's kind of at the far fringes of the evangelical right and sort of manic explosions of Islamophobic mania. It's not really part of the mainstream Western discourse any longer. But non-Muslim Western academic accounts, interestingly, do nowadays, if we read a general non-Muslim introduction to Islam, frequently point out the central role which reason, critical thinking, has always played in formal Islamic theology. So Oliver Leaman, for instance, says that whereas Judaism is strongly linked with ethnicity and Christianity with a leap of faith, Islam has successfully grown by contrast with these religions by stressing its rationality and evidentiality. And perhaps the greatest writer in European languages on the history of Islamic theology, Joseph van Es of Tübingen, concludes in rather similar terms. He's written this 4-volume enormous history of early Islamic theology. It's really, it's almost worth learning German in order to read the thing. It really is the best thing that's happened so far in that field. So this is Van Es, not a Muslim, but he comes up with this judgment. Christianity speaks of the mysteries of faith. Islam has nothing like that. For St. Paul, reason belongs to the realm of the flesh. For Muslims, reason, aql, has always been the chief faculty granted human beings by God. So it's not just Muslim apologetics worried about Orientalist or colonial polemic that have presented Islam as the religion of aql, of reason, and hence with those implications for how Islamic education is to be constructed. But we find plenty of non-Muslim sort of analysts of Islamic thought also coming independently to the same sort of conclusion. Now, if you look at these attempts, virtually all of them, Muslim or non-Muslim, attempts to portray Islam as the reasonable monotheism par excellence, we find that they tend to take their point of departure in the Quranic text. So Leaman says, the Quran does indeed display an unusual commitment to argument and logic in its self-explanation. And Rosalind Gwynn, some of you might have seen her book on God's Arguments, which is about the logical structure of the Quran. One of the best things that I've seen on that, has offered really a systematic exposition of this, how most of the classical forms of Aristotelian syllogism and logic are actually to be found in the modes of argument that are proposed in the Quranic text. So such characterizations of Quranic religion as implicitly hospitable to dialectical processes and a natural theology are, with the kind of sun setting on the traditional sort of phobic phase of Western Orientalism, now, if not the default position, but a very widely respected position amongst Western students of Islamic intellectual history. However, the equation is not uncontested, that is to say, the equation that says Islam equals rationality, the Quran equals logical inference. Because contrasting sharply with this comfortable model of an essentially Islamic rationality and reasonableness, we find, for instance, the increasingly salient modern fundamentalist tendencies emanating frequently from Saudi Arabia and tracing their ancestry back to Ibn Taymiyyah's inventive reading of scripture, which tended to reject the evolved systematic dialectics and logic of the madrasas and was markedly sceptical about reason's formal claims in matters of religion. Such thinkers held that all-important truth, binding truth, truth which saves, is necessarily explicit in the book, from which we have omitted nothing. مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. Scripture is clean, it is clear, kitab mubin. God has not burdened humanity with the requirement to evolve elaborate logical or metaphysical interpretations either of his evidences in nature or in the specific revelation of the Quran. The prophetic message is not really supposed to trigger a rush of philosophical speculation. And those who do so are guilty of underestimating both the clarity of the book, it's so clear, why reason, and the benign intentions of a deity who wishes all to be saved, including those ordinary mortals who are simply incapable of working through Aristotelian logic and cracking a syllogism. So both advocates of reason and minimizers of reason source their positions in Scripture. Who is, let's not say correct, but let's say who is normative in our tradition? One way of answering this might be to look further back in history, beyond the modern apologetics, which is so transparently reactive to a colonial history, and note the very prevalent favouring of aql, of reason, dialectics, rather than a Taymian literalism in pre-modern madrasa curricula, which did base education on sciences of nazar, formal theology, and legal theory sustained by a firm logical armature. That was the default, that was the norm in the classical madrasa. To support this, one can easily document the notable thinness of support for Ibn Taymiyyah's Hanbalite fideism and the centrality of sophisticated philosophical theology in the medieval curricula. This is the manuals of Jurjani, e.g. Nasafi, Taftazani, the later summaries, the commentaries, the super commentaries, which were generated. The community's scholars overwhelmingly welcomed the logic-based theologies which, definitively schematized by Razi, believed that they traced their roots back to early Islam's need to deploy some form of dialectic against schismatics, mainly the Mu'tazila, and vindicated themselves through reference to God's own debating techniques in Scripture. Kalam, particularly in its later expressions, presented itself as a fiercely, rigorously inductive and rationalistic discipline. According to some, and this is another interesting evolution of the West story about our intellectual life, even more inductive and rationalistic than falsafa, than Islamic philosophy. So here we have an image of the Kalam as being more philosophical even than the falsafa of Ibn Sina, which is something that Eric Ormsby has written about in his recent book about Ghazali. That's really where you find serious philosophy that's of abiding intellectual interest in the Islamic world, not so much in Ibn Sina, but in the Kalam appropriation of Ibn Sina, which purged it of some of its sort of weirder dimensions. And this again, Frank Griffel and Robert Wisnowski and other leading historians of Islamic intellectual thought are increasingly moving in the direction of greater respect for this philosophical integrity and independence of our madrasa curriculum and its Kalam dialectics. So we find that, say, a very standard Kalam text, the one that was taught in all of the Ottoman madrasas and that they still teach in the Ilahiyat colleges in Turkey, which is Taftazani's Sharh al-Aqaid. This is from the late 14th century. We find that in this book, even though it's not from the world of falsafa, it's from the world of Kalam, 3/4 is dedicated to systematic metaphysics, Ilahiyat. 3/4 of it is Ilahiyat, and the remainder dedicated to the nubuwat, sam'ayat, things that can only be demonstrated through recourse to revelation. The point is, that was Islam's classical norm. The scholars opted for this in the madrasa curriculum rather than the Hanbalite fideism of Ibn Taymiyyah or the Sufi inductive sort of spiritual alternative, which was never inserted into the madrasa curriculum despite the scholars' respect for its existence in another infrastructure of institutions and texts. So, despite this recurrent norm in our civilization, Kalam, particularly this very rigorous, intellectualizing, logic-based, difficult metaphysical tradition, received with favour throughout the madrasa tradition classically, has been dislodged increasingly by the recent, not even post-colonial, but perhaps post-colonial, repristination of a Taymian discourse rooted in a particular minority view of the intentions of Scripture and the wisdom of the ordinary believer. But even that, to give them their due, cannot be dismissed as particularly evidently un-Quranic. So we need, despite the fact that the ulama have always favoured Kalam, to see whether they were right. So let's take a look at the texts themselves. Now, the Quran is, as one would expect from any prophetic deliverance of truth, a staccato, ecstatic collocation of insights, promises, and forebodings. Famously, but not uniquely, you think of the Psalms, for instance, it is in no need of respecting conventional notions of thematic sequence. Even though Rosalind Gwynn has come up with this book about the typology of divine debating techniques, most Muslims in practice, experiencing their scripture, listening to their scripture in the liturgy, experience it not as a set of philosophical integrated cumulative arguments, but as a dithyramb which progressively affects the soul. It is the soul which drinks in the message of the Quran rather than the sort of dialectical or syllogistic dimension or layer of the Quran's discourse which Gwynn has identified. Now, of course, the text does contain those arguments, but it does remain very, very, very manifestly dissimilar to the kind of systematic manual which is normal in the madrasa universe. Hard to imagine anything more different to Al-Quran al-Karim than, say, the Sharh al-Aqaid of Taftazani. It's from a completely different level of discourse. Similarly, its frequent difficulty has often made the Quranic text an unpromising text for literalists. It's often famously presenting us with mubhamat and mutashabihat. And even the literalists were often caught up in the mystical tide, which represented the more significant non-Taymian alternative in our classical civilization to the epistemology of kalam. For most classical Muslims, for 1,000 years, the real alternative, if you didn't really want to get into all of those different kinds of syllogism in doing your engagement intellectually with religion, you go to some Sufi context. You wouldn't go to a Taymian context, which is a very, very small kind of fringe of the already small Hanbali school. And certainly, until recent times, literalist piety, those Muslims who are skeptical about too philosophical reading of the text, typically found its outlet not in purely formalist religion, but in forms of Sufism, normally in its kind of normative Junaidi garb. And that was the alternative to a reading of the Quran as being a foundation for a philosophical metaphysics. It's quite easy to see how this happened. Much of the scripture's power does seem to lie in its orality, the sonorousness of the language, in our human receptivity to the ineffable's mantic voice. Its language and imagery are anagogical, not linear. It educates through the divine presence actualized in that kalam mystery of God's uncreated speech. Quranic cantillation, tajweed, which you might say is the Islamic art par excellence, thus appears really as a purely non-rational mode of education, of drawing out. When you hear tajweed, it's 1,000 miles from the nearest philosophy manual. Its effect in transforming the heart through its particular sonorities, its oral alchemy, is something that is from a mystical, if you like, rather than a discursive and philosophical register. So here's a text from one of my famous authors. This is Isabel Eberhardt. Maybe some of you, particularly the sisters, have read Isabel Eberhardt, the famous 19th century Swiss eccentric convert, very eccentric, who went to Tunis, converted to Islam, and travelled around North Africa, and she died in her 20s, tragically, drowned in the desert. That just shows how unusual she was. And she left us with this diary of her travels, which show us those profoundly religious communities before any kind of reformism, whether Taymian or liberalist, had taken up with them. So here she is describing, in actually very beautiful French, a mosque in Algiers. The place was cool and dark as I went in, and a handful of oil lamps were the only source of light. A feeling of ancient Islam, tranquil and mysterious. I stood for a long time near the mihrab. Somewhere far behind us, a clear, fresh, high voice went up, a dreamlike voice that took turns with that of the elderly imam standing in the mihrab, where he recited the Fatiha with his quavering voice. Standing next to each other, we all prayed as we listened to the exhilarating yet solemn exchange between those two voices. The one in front of us sounded old and hoarse, but gradually grew louder till it was strong and powerful, while the other one seemed to come from somewhere high up in the mosque's dark reaches as it sang triumphantly in regular intervals of its unshakable, radiant faith in Allah and His Prophet. I felt almost in ecstasy, my chest tightening and my heart soaring up towards the heavenly regions that the second voice seemed to be coming from in a tone of melancholy joy, utterly convinced and at peace. Oh, to lie upon the rugs of some silent mosque, far from the mindless noise of city life, and eyes closed, the soul's gaze turned heavenwards, listen to Islam's song forever. Now, that's her experience of the Quran, and it's educating here through presence, mercy, and healing. Rahmatun wa shifa. It is a therapy, a balm for hearts injured by doubts and sinful desires. That's how Eberhardt heard the text. The scripture seems to imply that our tragedy is an ignorant alienation from the real, al-haq, the sole source of wholeness and appropriate human life and behavior, and that only heaven can send down the rain which can revive the desert of the soul. The book doesn't seem to be saving us or drawing us out, educare, education, through formal analogies and static inference. It doesn't deny such things, but it insists on an epistemology of descending upon your heart, نزله على قلبك, the heart, not the aql, because its author declares itself incomparable and unreachable by the faculties of perception. لا تدركه الأبصار, beyond any kind of human cognitive apperception. And it's no coincidence that Islam very quickly showed a historic hospitality to Platonism, which many modernists, champions of a presumed Averroist rationalism, regret, but noted in detail by Henri Corbin and others. And this is to be attributed not only to the Platonic habit of resolving all diversity to the completely unitive source, very congenial to Islam's rejection of a triune or other differentiation within the Godhead, but also to the sense that, as in Plato's Timaeus, the one is manifest aesthetically and particularly musically in the ground of creation. Ion, in the early dialogue with Socrates, acknowledges that as a singer of poems, he is an instrument played upon by a supernatural power. And the Holy Prophet Muhammad, like him, could be likened to an Aeolian harp. The wind plays him while his mortal personhood contributes nothing. The voice which draws out is therefore the pure sound and presence of the unseen. God's education of him takes place so far from the schoolroom that he is unlettered, ummi. The Quran, described in a hadith as mizmar min mazamir ali Dawood, a pipe from the woodwind pipes of the family of David, is in this, we might say, rather Platonic sense, understood as the voice of the divine substrate of creation. It's the true music of the spheres. The ascent to the One, therefore, is not through the logic-chopping powers of our dingy clay, but through acquiring a true and loving ear that can properly hear this music. True learning is, as Sohrawardi put it, an escape from the city of reason, an escape from the city of reason to the wilderness where God can be found. So this is education of a different kind, not education through the accumulation, reasoning through a mountain of arguments, evidences, premises and proofs, but through the deepening of our ontological consciousness, through the deepest part of the human self, through experiencing the cantillation of the uncreated speech, reconnecting to the very ground of being itself. So you can see why Plato was gobbled up by so many Muslim thinkers. Perhaps some souls have imagined this is the lesson of the Quranic prologue to history. Remember those enigmatic verses towards the beginning of Al-Baqarah, where the devil, Iblis, falls from grace. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the angelic orders to prostrate themselves before Adam, the newly created creature, and they do so except Iblis, who protests that you have created me of fire and him of clay. So this proud worshipper of God alone, who uses logic to defy God's own command, is cast out to become the calamity of the world. Meditating on this Quranic story, some Sufis have taken it as a condign warning against a presumptuous, vainglorious reliance upon reason, and so against the first sin, the first disobedience ever, Iblis's refusal of the commandment to prostrate, which originated in a syllogism. You created me out of fire and him out of clay, so I'm going to use reason to defy your command. God's command for his lovers is enough. His beauty makes all sort of argumentation irrelevant. So here's some famous lines by Jalaluddin Rumi in this kind of implicitly anti-rationalistic voice. O Master, you must avoid the analogy drawn by the low senses in regard to the revelation which is illimitable. If your sensuous ear is fit for understanding the letter of the revelation, know that your ear that receives the unseen meaning is deaf. The first person who produced these paltry analogies in the presence of the lights of God was Iblis. He said, beyond doubt, fire is superior to earth. I am of fire, and he, Adam, is of dingy earth. And this too is a hugely influential reading of the Quran. Rumi remains unchallenged as Islam's greatest and most widely read poet. Here, it is love that is the buraq, the mysterious winged beast that helps us to rise to true knowledge. Reason, the steed of those formal mullahs in the madrasa with their commentaries on Taftazani, is a noble part of God's creation, but it's desperately slow and limited. So he goes on to say this: intelligence is like swimming in the seas. He, the swimmer, is not saved. He is drowned at the end of the business. Leave off swimming. Let pride and enmity go. This is not the Oxus or a lesser river. It is an ocean. And moreover, it is the deep ocean without refuge. It sweeps away the seven seas like straw. Love is as a ship for the elect. Seldom is calamity the result. For the most part, it is deliverance. Sell intelligence and buy bewilderment. Intelligence is opinion, while bewilderment is immediate vision. Sacrifice your understanding in the presence of Mustafa. Say, Hasbi Allah, for God sufficeth me. So we have these two very strong, more or less irreconcilable positions about how the Quran is asking us to develop our epistemology, our theory of knowledge. And Muslims have thus found themselves historically dispersed over a very, very wide epistemological spectrum. The Quran has been historically so fertile, or we might say so open to different receptions, that Ibn Rushd, flagged up by many in the Arab world together as the iconic Arab rationalist, who pushes away Ibn Sina and his sort of Iranian mystical irrationalism, can use its verses as exemplary cases of rational induction. It's common in Ibn Rushd to do this in his polemic against Ibn Sina's putative mysticism. And modern Muslim rationalists like Fazl ar-Rahman very often use this kind of discourse as a means to dispel mystical fancies. The madrasa curriculum, it is true, has been overwhelmingly dialectical, not inspirational. But the fact of the uncreated Quran, Kalamullah al-Qadim, its origin in the Empyrean, has made it also the religion's theophany of theophanies, a fully mystic fact, whose very shape or sound inspires an ecstasy that seems to draw out the divine nature more reliably than any logical inference ever could. The presence, the, as it were, tangible presence of the eternal uncreated word in our ears is something that gives us a more direct access to al-Haq tabaraka wa ta'ala than any amount of logic chopping, despite what the theologians have always preferred. So the Quran thus seems historically in our heritage to be the authentic root of two disciplines whose mutual relations are controversial. Formal systematic theology, kalam, and Sufism, tasawwuf. There have been other epistemologies, but pretty tiny compared to these two big ones. Walk through any classical Islamic manuscript library and you'll see what people are writing about. Sufism, typically absent, as we've seen from the scholastic madrasa curriculum, which historically gave pride of place to kalam as the supreme science. Formal theological texts defined orthodoxy, and yet, another paradox, they seem to have been a lot less influential on the minds of ordinary believers than the emotional Sufism of the likes of Rumi, whose pessimism about nazar is really an important part, almost a cliche in his verse. Formal education, concentrated in the madrasa, which coexisted in complex ways with the Sufi lodge, the khanaqah, the dargah, the tekke, the zawiyah down the road, seen of a very different theory of education, a very different pedagogy, which far from being marginal was often much more attuned to the concerns of popular piety, and whose literary productions were known probably many tens of times more widely than were the productions of the madrasa theologians. The masses desire both the direct access to the holy and for a commonsensical reading of the plain meaning of scripture ensured, or was one factor which ensured the ongoing popularity of Sufism for many centuries. Thinkers like Ghazali, who are normative in mainstream Sunnism, spoke of kalam as a valid discipline within its own essentially apologetic and even therapeutic space, as a useful tool, or kind of weapon, to wield against formalistic errors, notably those of Ibn Sina's philosophy and the Mu'tazila. And that's what kalam was for. If there were rationalizing heretical challenges to orthodoxy, you would produce a kalam argument in order to defeat the rationalists at their own game, providing the Muslims with a suit of armor to defend them against doctrinal malfunction. As though to refute those who characterized Muslim theology as denying the rationality of the divine, he insisted that the formal rules of logic have an objective validity which must characterize the divine power and acts. As the shape of his own career, of course, implied, he regarded inner experience, or what he calls tasting, dhawq, as superior, although it can never challenge the truths which are drawn out by theology. Instead, it provides a more authentic proof for them. And this was his resolution, and of course he himself lived through a crisis which indicated, as he makes it quite clear, the inadequacy, ultimately, of traditional pedagogy and the traditional exoteric curriculum to deliver certain truth about God and the nature of existence to his superlative intellect. But he doesn't deny the theology, he merely regards it as propedeutic, or you might say therapeutic. If there's heretics in town, if there's a Mu'tazili khutbah, you can use kalam in order to explain why that particular rationalizing option doesn't work. Now, before the modern decay of this old bifurcation, which was very standard across the board in madrasas from Sumatra to Senegal, pretty consistent, Sufism, kalam, each in their own space, and with this Ghazalian relationship, mutual affirmation between the two. Before nowadays, all of this has really been thrown into the modern sort of boiling sea of Muslim questions, but before that bifurcation decayed, processes of synthetic renewal, which often drew in individuals acclaimed as the mujaddidun of their centuries, the renewers, furnished a key dynamic for Islamic religion and history. Tendencies that were seen to be erroneous or downright heretical were often understood as the result of an imbalance towards one type of epistemology at the expense of the other. When madrasa or Sufi lodge evolved excessively at each other's expense, damaging the proper counterpoint between the two. And Ghazali is regarded as the most obvious and successful case of a polemicist who reinvigorates the synthesis and the symbiosis. But there's other claimants, you might say Abdurrahman Jami, Ibn Kamal, Ottoman Mufti, Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, Said Nursi. There are plenty of other people who have tried to repristinate this balance between spirit and intellect. And Sachiko Murata and William Chittick have reflected extensively in some of their recent publications on this inner Islamic metabolism of a complexly symbiotic dual epistemology, identifying kalam with the principle of drawing out inferences about God as dissimilarity, laysa kamithlihi shay, tanzih. That's the register of discourse inhabited by the mutakallimun. The dyadic categorization of divine predicates as names of Jalal and Jamal, rigor and names of beauty, was perhaps the most familiar outcome. Sufism, thanks to the principle of experiencing God as similarity, the idea of holiness as present in the world, God's signs representing in some paradoxical ontological sense the presence of the divine, of al-qarib, وَهُوَ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. The discourse of tashbih, the habitat of the Sufi speculative thinkers and theologians, occupied a parallel discourse, and this, as Murad and Chittick and others have pointed out, became a kind of constant of our civilization. The divine otherness is dealt with by those kalam theologians with their really dry curriculum in the madrasa, and the divine tashbih, likeness, is dealt with by Sufi thinkers with their personal experience of the ground of existence as being rooted in the divine. And the polarity between the names of Jalal and the names of Jamal is one of the dimensions of this. These two inexorable consequences of the postulate of monotheism, in a sense, any monotheism that starts to think about itself has to simultaneously affirm transcendence and immanence, tanzih and tashbih. They run like twin constants to Muslim intellectual history and religious history. And it's characteristic of our culture that each was usually allocated its own realm, its form of discourse, its vocabulary, and even sometimes ritual expression and structured authority. It's one of the recurrent settlements in Islamic culture that the madrasa has done the kalam and the fiqh, and the Sufi lodge has done the sort of experiential, personal, emotive path to God. Different institutions, which was not the case, for instance, in Christendom, which tended to put everything into monastically based sort of scholastic educational setting, the beginning of the modern university, everything is there together. In our civilization, we didn't do that. Anyway, there was this fairly stable modus vivendi, which in the modern period was progressively eroded when, first of all, the synthetic theologies, the Asharis and the Maturidis, were challenged by modernists and fundamentalists, both of whom, for quite different reasons, had become uncomfortable with mysticism and kalam, and who conceived a post-civilizational piety in which antinomies and parallel discourses were experienced and suppressed as destabilizing principles. People like Rashid Rida of that generation saw the presence of these different institutions, the bifurcation or the fissiparous fragmentation of Islamic epistemologies into different types of books, different ways of using Arabic, different hierarchies of individuals, different institutions. They saw this as being an unnecessary fragmentation and wanted to bring it together. This is one of the foundations of the conception of the modern Islamic university, which is essentially based on the shriveling and the withering away of the tashbih discourse of the Sufi lodges and a kind of expansion of a reformist and kind of simplified version of what used to happen in the madrasas. So we have this, what I call post-civilizational piety, reactive piety, antinomies, parallel discourses experienced as sources of division and hence potential sources of weakness in the face of the shared colonial thread. Now, once, and it's very characteristic of many of our modern believers, where once, in earlier generations of Muslim history, a kind of pious skepticism about logic chopping and syllogistic ways of demonstrating the existence and the nature of God would have reflected itself in terms of moving in the direction of Sufism of some kind, as with some of the most illustrious Hanbali authors, Hanbalism being a particularly fertile sort of crucible and context for Sufism. You think of Abdul Qadir Jilani, Khwaja Abdullah Ansari, people who are not really happy with philosophical approaches to God and want their Sufism to take place in their particular reading of scripture in a Hanbali context. But whereas that was the classical Muslim response to being not happy with aql as the key basis to your religious epistemology, go down the road and start clapping hands and singing Persian songs with the Sufis. Nowadays it's different because that cynicism has often combined itself with the rejection of the Sufi discourse as well, and that's really new. Under post-traditional conditions presided over very often by new post-colonial nation states with new centralizing ministries of education, who often are the ones who decide how these structures are going to be finessed. The old binary model of Islamic education may today be described as shattered and possibly vanished entirely. The dominant state religious curricula, whether it be in Egypt or Libya or Uzbekistan or in many places, generally aiming to promote, because it's what the politicians and the kings and the republics want, a kind of quietist, not very political, civic faith, has not filled the gaps left by the great madrasa institutions of the past, because the intellectual richness is really not much there any longer. Most of their students, even their graduates, struggle even with a short version of the Sharh al-Aqaid, let alone the kind of huge things that you couldn't even lift if anybody's still lifting them off the shelves any longer. That richness has been abandoned because of this statist agenda to create institutions, madrasas, new Islamic institutes that will produce functionaries that will not rock the boat and will open the doors to various models of development and modernity. Something like Taftazani doesn't really fit with that. Still less have these new institutions compensated for the spiritual and aesthetic loss entailed by the closure of the initiatic institutions such as the Sufi lodges and also the craft guilds. We tend to forget the asnaf were a very important aspect of life in Muslim civilization until 100 years ago, and a place where a lot of people received their education. If you were a journeyman training to be a craftsman, maybe not literate, you would get your education on the job doing a 7-year apprenticeship to make boots or to weave cloth or something. Education very often took place, at least in an urban context, in the environment of the asnaf. Not the Sufi lodge and not the madrasa, but with the asnaf. And that's vanished almost everywhere without trace, to the extent that we've almost forgotten that it was so important. So we've lost the initiatic institutions. I think it was Nasser who decided that the Sufi lodges of Cairo should be turned into party headquarters for his party, the National Democratic Party, and that's a sure way of destroying any kind of real serious spiritual and initiatic work. But the same thing happened throughout the Islamic world. And the result is often the shallow and vehement tenor of a lot of contemporary Islamic discourse in our generation. Because the state schools, which are there on a huge scale but generally rather poor educationally, have delivered a kind of vague but emotive sense of Muslim belonging, a sense that one has a Muslim identity that is at risk, but haven't easily inculcated compassion, aesthetics or wisdom, or the sort of deep dialectical and philosophical reasons for adherence. So deprived of access to a serious theological education, but having no access to the Sufi illuminationism, which was its traditional counterpoint, young Muslims, pupils and students often incline either to secular lifestyles or to non-mystical readings of Ibn Taymiyyah, because they just don't have access to the richness of those traditional bifurcated institutions. Where else are they going to go? To suggest how some form of authentically Muslim education might evolve or recuperate following the spectacular collapse of the old binary arrangement, it might prove helpful to rewind a bit and focus on the early period when this visible bifurcation hardly yet existed. Before the 3rd century of our era, it was not customary to record inner experiences and unveilings, and it's therefore not easy always to discern how these interacted with other registers of religious discourse or transformed the whole. However, it seems likely that a close integration was normal. And this was certainly the case with regards the balance between reason and revelation, if you like, aql and naql, which again don't seem to have been experienced at all as dichotomous principles in the first 2 centuries. Towards the end of this period, you have the emergence of the first Mu'tazilite theologians, and they seem really to have been the first to have conceived that there might be a tension, aql and a kind of zero-sum game with naql or tradition. And although the consensus of the community finally decided against Mu'tazilism, on the grounds, I guess, of its tendency to expand and inflate human freedom to a degree which made God decidedly unfree, the polarity which the Mu'tazilites had identified did remain a theme, the idea that there's a kind of tension between aql and naql, and this proved its durability in a number of autonomous Sunni contexts. Prior to this possibly inevitable bifurcation, which at its extremes led to a very arid transcendentalism. So Zamakhshari, the Mu'tazilite, laughs at the Sufis because they claim to love God, and his idea of God is so abstract and philosophical you couldn't possibly love something that ends up being a kind of equation. Or to the other end of the spectrum, sort of extreme forms of Ghulat, Ismaili Shi'ism with resurrections of ancient Eastern theories of divine incarnation, hulul. You have the fiqh in the early period, the understanding, meaning not just what it means today, but meaning an integrated experience of mind, body and soul. Remember, Imam Abu Hanifa, with his little al-fiqh al-akbar, isn't talking about sharia at all, really. He's talking about what you believe. The term fiqh is something that changed from the way in which it was used in the early period, when it just meant an understanding, a cognitive grasp of the content of religion in a very holistic sense. In the apostolic period, the era of the Salaf, aql, a word which later evolved in complex and sometimes contentious ways, essentially denoted fiqh itself. And this certainly was the insight, say, of somebody like Muhasibi, and taken up in Ghazali's great project of reintegration. Ghazali not happy with the way in which these different disciplines and approaches to knowledge are kind of moving out into different areas and different sections of Muslim society. And the agenda of his Ihya really is to pull them together, to show how the kalam coexists with the fiqh, which coexists with the kashf, in a single sort of summa, a single integrated model, whose agenda is, as he says, to take the Muslims back to the initial integration of those principles, which was the gift of the first 3 generations. For the first Muslims, it's pretty clear that knowledge was not obtained by formally alternate, possibly complementary routes. Truth was given in the ayat, the vestigia Dei, which are evident in nature, which mystically activated the heart, a process facilitated and given a discursive outcome by the special revelation in Scripture. Aql or fiqh are not solitary principles or methods. Rather, every evolution which they implied into areas of sometimes recondite logical theory was the consequence of originally unitive epistemology, to which the Qur'an, in its sonic and discursive totality, provided the key. The Holy Prophet's own mysticism, exemplified in vital episodes of his life, such as the Mi'raj, was not a kind of affective rapture disconnected from the fields of aql or fiqh, but was simply one of its dramatic expressions and outcomes. So we find that in primal Islam, before this sort of institutional bifurcation, which has now collapsed, the word aql inhabited a supple and comprehensive semantic field. And there's a hadith which displays a principle that later underlay juridical arguments over the extent and limits of human accountability, the arguments over taklif. So the hadith says, the pen does not record the works of three types of people: one sleeping until he awakes, the one who is mentally unsound until he regains his sanity, hatta yaqil, and the child before he attains maturity. Another hadith where we get a kind of prophetic insight into what the mind is. Four human types shall be excused on the day of resurrection: a deaf man who could hear nothing, a stupid person, ahmaq, so I guess quite a few of my students are going to be lucky, don't quote me, a senile man, and someone who died in the period, fatra, between the decline of one prophetic episode and the arrival of the next. Here the prophetic voice explains that consciousness is what defines our status as human beings. Aql is that which makes us human and distinguishes us from the other orders of creation for which there will be no eschatological judgment. In other hadiths we find a more abstract portrayal of the mind. So when Allah created the aql, He commanded it to come and it came. Then He commanded it to move away and it moved away. Then He declared, I have created nothing nobler than you. It is through you that I take and through you that I give. There's a whole list of these sayings from the early Salaf and hadith in a book on aql by Salahuddin al-Munajjid, which I expect you have in the library here if you want to see the extent of this early Islamic discussion of aql as that which characteristically defines our membership of humanity. So one could multiply these examples, but it's clear that the new religion valued aql in some sense highly, albeit in a very versatile and intuitive way that actually implies a broader definition than the usual contemporary understanding of rationality or mind, a principle of consciousness which nowadays is reductively understood to have a purely neurological basis. The starting point is the corpus as what Rosalind Gwynn calls God's arguments, the Qur'an's own reasoning, which allows the mood of primal Islam to maintain a high regard for the mind. Indeed, some of the first Christians, interestingly, who observed Islam, people like John of Damascus, for instance, had argued that Islam is inferior because of its emphasis on reason and its apparent disinterest in mystery. That's interesting. The need to filter the proliferating hadith canon with systematic tools, not only of textual authentication, but also of analogical methods of inferring laws. So the growing need for qiyas in its ramifying complex ways, ensured that intellectual precision was expected of scholars, excepting occasionally some of those Hanbalites who preferred the anthologizing of huge quantities of sometimes doubtful material and were skeptical about the validity of at least more ambitious forms of analogical reason. The generation of an expert elite was a necessary consequence not only of Islam's evolving response to new intellectual threats, things like Greek philosophy and stuff that the first three generations didn't have to deal with, but of the inherent complexity and massive bulk of the founding texts themselves. The sheer enormity of the hadith literature, maybe over 1 million distinct hadiths, meant that one really needed to use one's mind in a systematic way in order to negotiate in a systematic way this enormous body of often difficult material. And the nature of these texts actually made Islam an infertile context for exoteric fundamentalism. Again, literalism tended to lead the community towards Sufism, and Hanbali Sufism in particular, rather than to a simple-minded exoterism. Remember this point that I made earlier about the Taymian option being a very, very small fraction of what appealed to the ulama in the history of Islam. Generally, if you were skeptical about syllogisms, you would move in the direction of Sufism rather than a kind of simple exoteric form of Hanbalism. Now, the early material from the Salaf that we've just sort of in a sketchy way looked at doesn't refer to the intellect in anything like a scholastic way, although it does come to be cited by those who evolve such definitions. Instead, what the early Muslims seem to have understood by the category is a general humanistic sense that our integrity is maintained by rational deliberation, a principle which underlines axioms of piety such as the careful formulation of intentions, self-scrutiny, the exclusion of emotion and egotism from the exegesis of scripture. So aql incorporates that. So aql is not really reason or rationality. For our civilization, particularly in the early years, it's something bigger than that. And aql also incorporates sort of thaumaturgic and pneumatological practices of how to deal with the demon within. So aql incorporates centrally the principle of self-knowledge and self-control. Not surprising when you consider the original etymological sense of aql, which is the hobbling cord that stops your camel from getting lost in the desert when you're sleeping at night. It's the rope. Aql is that which binds and which restrains. And so any kind of spiritual practice restraining the ego, very much incorporated in this early Islamic sense of what aql was doing. And this, of course, places Islam very much in the context of all ancient thought, which believed that knowledge of any kind has to begin with self-knowledge. It's really the point of origin of Greek philosophy. What was the slogan written over the entrance to the oracle at Delphi in Greek? Know thyself. Before you do anything, you have to know what it is that is knowing. And this is one of the shortcomings of modern philosophy. They have a very poor understanding of human selfhood. Philosophy of mind is a very contested and flimsy thing, particularly in the postmodern context. And yet this human subject is supposed to be doing the philosophizing and looking through the Hubble Space Telescope and understanding the world. That's one of the weaknesses of the late modern project. But in previous civilizations, spirituality was always the beginning. Know thyself. And then you have a coherent human subject capable of self-knowledge, discipline, aware of its emotional weaknesses, and then it can start to make rational theory choices. Which again, because of the decline of the classic madrasa curriculum, is something that we don't see enough in our communities. We don't have that early training in how to understand our own tendencies towards ego, towards anger, towards envy, and very often the religious discourse is driven by those vices rather than fighting against them, and the result is everything from extreme liberal theologies to extreme fundamentalist tendencies. It's the nafs which is in the driving seat. So know thyself is the beginning of all wisdom in our theology. This is not controversial. And really the whole discipline of Sufism in the early period emerged in part to provide formal mechanisms for the general sense that there needed to be a restraint placed upon the ego. The beast of the ego needed to be pulled back, and the discourse that the civilization developed for that was the discourse of tasawwuf, rooted ultimately in those moments in the seerah, the Prophet's life, where the Prophet is explicitly wearing wool, which are identified as ascetical moments of self-discipline and initiation, the idea of the woolen robe of the Prophet. Now, so we have this discipline of Sufism, just as Kalam has emerged, really in order to deal with the threat of philosophy and the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah and a whole load of other people who are gaining popularity amongst sort of confused young people, to knock that on the head. Similarly, Sufism developed as a method of using the richness of the prophetic tradition and heritage in a way that would enable people systematically to understand what their souls were doing, to have a theory of the soul. And Islamic psychology might be a contemporary way of explaining what the early Muslims were doing in developing this particular Sharia science. So this is the emergence of this, and Ghazali sees very clearly how necessary it is to have this discipline as a preliminary or propedeutic to any kind of nazar. This is one of the great insights and the indispensable points that Imam al-Ghazali makes. When you're doing your theology and working out how to defend the correct aqidah against the Mu'tazila or the Qadianis or whoever it might be, in order to make that a rigorous form of ilzam, so you're arm wrestling your opponent into forcible acquiescence, as if you're kind of writing out an equation and there can only be one answer. In order to do that, for da'wah purposes, for the defense of Islam, first of all, you have to know what a good theory choice is and what a good argument is. And you can only do that if you've overcome the beast within, the nafs ammara bis-su'. If that is still raging, then it's going to go for wrong choices. The self has to be completely neutral in terms of its emotional turbulence when it does anything like aql, nazar, philosophical theology. And of course, when it does fatwa, when it does tafsir, when it grades hadith, any other aspect of Islamic scholarship, it's essential that the first step in that is controlling one's emotion, one's prejudices, one's rancor, one's envy. Otherwise, religion will just become an ugly mirror to our own turbulences. And again, there's a lot of it about nowadays. So that was the context for the emergence of Sufism as a necessary discipline to understand and control the turbulences of the ego as a propedeutic to correct theory choice. And this is systematically set out in Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya al-Ulumuddin. Primal Islam, Ghazali points out, had launched an integrative human project which united bodily functions through consciously assessed and calibrated purity laws and rituals. Every last thing is included and sanctified in a complete art for human life, which is called the Sunnah, integrated with social relations, political and economic life, formal worship, and the gifts of the spirit. It's all part of one practice. And as Ghazali reminded his generation, the purpose of every form of the revealed law is to uplift humanity through dhikrullah, the remembrance of God. And this reminder requires a consciousness that seemed to be inseparable from reason. You can only truly remember God, understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's action and the presence of his attributes in the world if you're using your reason. For Ghazali, and therefore for normative classical Sunni Muslims, the disciplined mind is in a sense, you could say it's identical to the Sunnah, the prophetic precedent. Fiqh, including and even especially its practical regulatory aspects, is intelligence, not just a mechanism of physical and societal order. And here Islam departed very markedly from the classical European insistence on a dichotomy between body and mind. Real rationalism, that is to say reverence for the miracle of aql, has to include a belief in innate knowledge, since the experiences of the senses are actually inadequate in explaining how we have come to know certain things. This was the basis of Ghazali's sort of moment of doubt, his epistemic catastrophe. There are certain truths, such as the arithmetical, which we experience as intuitive and as rooted in an innate knowledge. They're not just a consequence of our opinion, they are there intrinsically. Ethical knowledge also seems to be a priori. It's drawn out, education, edukari, it's drawn out of the human being, proceeding from aql as understood as the wise perceptions of the human totality, including the corporeal. This is, for those of you who read in modern philosophy, very similar to what Maurice Merleau-Ponty describes as the body subject. He's emphasizing the human embeddedness and the sensory context of all theory choice and of all theological and philosophical discourse, that we are not sort of disembodied minds, discarnate points of consciousness. Body and mind are two aspects of a single human totality. So true reason is therefore a kind of knowledge by recollection, dhikr, and we've seen that this, for many Muslims, called Plato's Timaeus to mind. What we know, where it matters, is what we have managed to remember, which is why the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is only a reminder, or dhakir. Well, the Quran too is a reminder, dhikr, and whoever wishes will remember. To achieve this remembering, this is the essence now of what this vision of education seems to be. To achieve this remembering, and therefore to account for the apparent mystery of our a priori knowledge of axioms and ethics, we're required to exist in a harmonious balance which incorporates body, intellect and soul into a single human subject, an omnium, al-insan al-kamil. Only such a being, dialectically regulated by kalam and emotionally disciplined by Sufism, is capable of real reason, of aql, and thus of being edukare, education drawn out. The classical Sunni consensus, as it evolved new disciplines to cope with the intellectual and societal challenges facing a post-Arabian ummah, was concerned to restore the well-being of this integrated human subject, conserving the primal unity of Islamic self by means of a complex armature of defense mechanisms which protected the community and the individual believer from an array of philosophical and social hazards. Only those scholars whom Imam al-Ghazali calls the hashwiyya, the kind of stuffing men, claim that Islam and its primal vision can be adequately protected without kalam and without tasawwuf, that Islam can, as it were, exist in the world naked without those forms of protection from heresy and the ego, and it'll be fine. As we've seen, the community consistently rejected the hashwiyya tendency. Islam always took itself to be a religion of intellectual and spiritual sophistication, not a naive and vulnerable fundamentalism. Islam itself was going to be a synergy of body, regulated by fiqh, intellect, polished endlessly by kalam, and spirit, deepened and accessed by Sufism, and in the normative Ghazalian vision, it was this harmony which would manifest and conserve the pristine integrality of the Islamic subject. So a few contemporary implications of this sort of rather medieval focused presentation. These modern Muslim ministries of education whose determination to emulate Western models has generated a kind of alienated youth psyche which seems so easily to support real secularity or dangerous fundamentalism, might possibly find grounds for sobering reflection in some more recent discussions which have evolved in the Western world. Generally, Third World Ministry of Education are run by people, usually men, whose culture is from the 1940s and the 1950s, maybe when their teachers at Cairo University were studying in France or England, and the discourse about education and what a national education system should be is really obsolete. So to give one example, to depart from this, but this is a hobby horse of mine, one thing that everybody is recognizing now in development studies is that countries which use their own language in mass education and higher education are much more likely to progress economically than countries which don't. So if you take, for instance, South Korea, 50 years ago, was economically similar to a place like Egypt or Pakistan. Now it's a developed country. What is the difference? Well, it can't be a coincidence that in Egypt, if you study engineering or medicine, you study in a kind of English because of an inferiority complex. Whereas in Korea, they've always been absolutely adamant that everything has to be in Korean. And whereas the Turks, for instance, changed their script because they thought if you had the Roman letters, they'd all somehow become wonderfully modern. The Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the people who are really moving ahead, have been sure to keep their traditional script. And even though the Chinese alphabet is, I gather, really difficult, a lot harder than the old sort of Arabic or Jawi or Ottoman, really difficult, that hasn't held them back from being an economic miracle with a consistent 6% annual growth rate. All the signs are that if you emphasize the beauty of your own language in schools, 1/3 of Korean curricula is based on Korean language and literature. That's the basis for their success. So I wish the Ummah would pay attention to this and have a little bit more respect for its own languages, inshallah, its own scripts, and to teach in its own language rather than have this strange bifurcation so that the medic can't really think very imaginatively because all the English he knows is something is picked up in the faculty, rather than being enriched by a wider social culture in which he's using the language of the faculty in a wider context. Very important, particularly for the research agenda. Anyway, that's the close of that particular parenthesis, but I think it is worth thinking about. So what I'm trying to say is that, just as a concluding thought, the old model of getting rid of the classical Islamic forms of education, neglect the Sufi lodges, stamp on them, turn them into party headquarters, and let the madrasas decline, confiscate the awqaf, turn the old madrasas where you allow them to survive into kind of quasi-secular Western-style universities with BAs and so forth. That has not saved the Muslim youth and the graduates of those institutions from feeling a cognitive dissonance and a sting in the soul, which often produces very divisive social outcomes, an extreme hedonistic, often corrupt personal apathy about morals, or on the other hand, a kind of weird, hyperventilating misreading of Atamian rigorism on the other, precisely the kind of bifurcation that is likely to tear any society in two. So the modernizing agenda of the ministers of education seems to have produced outcomes that they wouldn't have dreamt of even in their worst nightmares. But contemporary philosophers, contemplating the apparently fragmented contemporary self, have been exploring a range of remedies. Some have emphasized the importance of recovering an embodied wisdom as a basis for knowledge. Certain feminist thinkers, for instance, Luz Irigaray, have placed this at the center of their epistemology. Others have advocated some kind of secular retrieval of ancient spiritual techniques of meditation or ritual. Such moves are driven by a sense in the Western universities that the post-Enlightenment human subject is in crisis, and by a fear that the end result of the contemporary disaggregation of the body-mind-spirit composite may be a vehement reaction against one or a combination of these three principles. So many substantive forms of youth culture, for instance, now imply this imbalance. A dysfunction with regarding attitudes to the body, for instance, the fact that in the modern university there's no context for the integration of body, mind and spirit. You have the lecture, which is very cerebral, and then you have maybe a theatre or musical performance, which is emotive, and then you have the sports field, which is for the body, but there's no possible integrative principle such as that which is delivered by the Sunnah, the fiqh emphasis on body, mind, spirit, all being integrated into a single human subject. And people are starting to realize that the young people are suffering as a result. So whether this kind of unraveling of the idea of aql is going to prevail in Muslim societies may depend on the fortune not only of westernizing agendas, but also the current wave of kind of extremist Hashwiya zeal and certain other unmistakable signs of Muslim cultural decline and pedagogic failure. If it's the case that an implicit tension between body, mind and spirit provided a kind of point d'appui, a point of pressure for secularist tendencies, which ultimately allowed the collapse of Christian commitment in Europe and the fragmentation of the Western self, it's necessary to acknowledge that through modern influences, the same fissiparous tendency is shaping some of the most significant of contemporary Islamic societies. The modernist turn away from Kalam and from Sufism and from the texts of the great synthetic renewals which reintegrated Islam's various disciplines has produced very often a fragmented and impoverished Muslim intellectuality, forms of education and a spiritual habitus, which one might well pessimistically foretell will not long resist the same disenchanting tendencies which have caused the atrophy of European Christianity and the prevalence of what Charles Taylor calls the felt flatness of modernity. I've spoken for longer than I promised, and I'm going to close my laptop at this point, having probably overloaded you all with my prejudices, and thank you for your patience. And inshallah, I look forward to hearing your responses. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Yeah, okay, we have one question there.
Alaikum salam.
I realized that in Islamic education, memorization is a very important part, and I don't see you mentioning about it. And I also read somewhere that in Islamic education, memorization is attacked by the West. It is not. But I think, personally, it's my personal opinion, it is an important part and parcel of Islamic education. What is your further thinking about that?
It depends on whether the children or the young adults are given sufficient time to reflect intelligently on what it is that they are memorizing. I think that the wheel is now starting to turn, and if you look at the recent education reforms in England initiated by the former Education Secretary Michael Gove, they are moving back to not rote learning, but to memorization and to a more traditional type of textbook-based learning, because they're aware that just allowing 6 or 7-year-olds to read texts of a novel, for instance, and then to critically analyze it is completely meaningless. When they're really young, they just need to learn things. They need to learn sums, they need to learn basic ideas, they need to learn how the English language works. And memorizing texts, because the mind is a kind of muscle, is actually a very good way of strengthening the brain. Memorization is something that can strengthen the mind, and the mind is such an immensely capacious thing. There's no danger ever that the mind will be so full that you won't have time to learn to drive when you're 18 or something. It strengthens the mind, and the more you memorize, the better you are at memorizing, which is an essential human practice. The other thing that's been discovered by dementia researchers is that people who have memorized a large amount of text early in life and kind of keep it up are statistically rather less likely to suffer from Alzheimer's, Lewy bodies, dementia, and other forms of dementia when they're old, because their mind has been strengthened and stimulated by. And Hifz al-Quran is a very good way of doing this, particularly if people are old and losing their memories. If you keep up the Quran, it's an excellent way of pushing back the kind of cloud of unknowing for a few more years. So I think that the old sort of the 1950s type curriculum which I was describing and which has shaped even the current reality of a lot of Muslim schools is something that in the West itself is regarded as discredited, and we're moving back towards a respect for the fact that the mind of children is designed to memorize things. Mine can't. I can't even remember my mobile phone number. I'm ashamed to admit there's just too many numbers. I'm too old. I've given up. But when one is 6 or 7 or 8, you can memorize mountains of stuff because the mind before the age of 7 is designed for memorization. The human species naturally does it. And to deny that capacity in the child, that amazing lucidity of the mind, and to say that the child has to make a critical comparison of different political systems or some other stupid thing instead, when they're kind of hardly old enough to wipe their own noses, but it has to be analytical and liberal and thought-based, is really dangerous. So inshallah, the Muslim world will overcome this sort of inferiority complex and learn to take more pride in its brilliant traditions of memorization, which has been the basis of Islamic scholarship from the beginning.
Thank you very much for your rich lecture. I have one question for you. Are you proposing the reviving the Sufi heritage and practices, like in the Khanqa and Fiqhiyya and Zawiya? And how is it going to contribute to help to develop the Muslim Ummah, I mean, in other aspects, such as economy, politics and all that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't think that there's any possibility of reviving some pre-modern medieval model of what a curriculum was like in a madrasa or in an asnaf house or in a Sufi lodge. Those were specific to a particular time. We're not Mamluks any longer, we're not Ottomans any longer. Things have to be different. But I've been speaking about the cognitive dimension. In other words, the utility of Sufism as a means of overcoming the lower tendencies of the self, laziness, envy, rancor, all of these things were traditionally taught not in the madrasa but in the context of Sufism. And if they're no longer taught in the successor institutions, you have the Muslim masses that are just full of emotion, and every time somebody does a cartoon of the Holy Prophet, it's like he's got the capacity to press a button and a million Muslims start jumping and shouting, and it doesn't benefit us at all because we're just a mass of turbulences. Gut reactions are what determines the ummah, because we've lost that dimension of riyadat al-nafs. So the specific individual practices and so forth of the tariqas I don't see as necessarily having to form part of an Islamic future. But the key point of Sufism is that it's riyadat al-nafs. It is Islamic psychology, it is self-knowledge, overcoming those defects within that allow us to make good choices at the moment the ummah is not making good choices.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. I will try to go against the wave. Probably our problem is not about conflict between exoteric textual understanding of Islam and rationalism. It is about the conflict between religious theological mind and secular powerful wave which dominated the world today. What I mean by this sentence is sometimes we may over-exaggerate the problems, theological problems, rationalism, Sufism, although they existed all the way. They existed for more than 1400 years, and Muslims managed to live with. And we had, cycles. Sometimes one trend submerged, sometimes another one. But Muslims continue to exist, and sometimes even they led the world. Probably the big defeat was when the secular thought and science in its Western understanding was actually dominant. So I would like your insight in this matter. Are we over-exaggerating the effect of the conflict between rationalism and non-rationalism, or it is probably because of secularism?
Well, secularism, of course, is the third corner in this triangle. It's not just, as you've observed, reason, revelation. The reality is the elephant on the table in every Muslim context nowadays is the modern world, and its increasingly insistent demands that everybody conforms to its curricula and its values, which it takes to be universal. I accept that. My concern is that the way in which education systems have been secularized in the Muslim world over the last 50 or 100 years, by more or less deliberately suppressing sort of a deep spirituality and more or less deliberately suppressing a real sort of philosophical theology, has left young Muslims without adequate resources to deal with the challenges of modernity. If the modern world takes itself to be about science, regarding material reality as the ultimate ground of meaning, consciousness is essentially an aspect of brain function, and makes these very grave challenges to the premises of the religion, it's a disaster if the Islamic curriculum in the madrasas, let alone public secular schools, doesn't equip them with some kind of philosophical training to enable them to respond to those things. I've just come from Saudi Arabia, where the young people are kind of often completely disillusioned with religion and kind of actively atheistic now. And the reason is not because they've really come up with good arguments, but because nobody's given them even the basis of a kind of Islamic theological refutation of secularity. It's not very difficult to do, but there is no context in their school system for anything that resembles kalam or theology, because everything is kitab or sunnah, kitab or sunnah, kitab or sunnah. They've moved from the aql entirely to the naql, at a time when everywhere else in the world is moving to the aql, and that leaves them kind of naked and without armor and without protection. So the first time they go on YouTube and they see some atheist Tunisian talking about something, they're kind of shattered. So they haven't been given that protection. So I'm not suggesting we should revive, again, the sort of Mamluk or Ottoman styles, but the way in which secularity has impinged on and impoverished Muslim education, even in ostensibly religious colleges and universities, has meant that there aren't very many young people who really are properly philosophically aware of how to deal with these challenges, most of which are not new. The arguments against religion, they go back to the time of sort of Heraclitus and ancient Greek thinkers, and you can find responses to them in the Quran text. If we're sending young people out into the world without that training, then it's like throwing like throwing pigeons amongst cats, if you like. They're just vulnerable, and they're being gobbled up by missionaries, by atheists, by people of every persuasion, because we've lost the capacity to use a beautiful and Quranically obedient style of philosophical reflection, and it's a real shame. It's a lot of people are suffering as a result.
Okay.
Okay. My turn? Yeah. Okay, the question I'd like to ask is, you mentioned the body, mind, and soul integration, and definitely it has to happen at some point, but the problem is not just at the university state. It's not being integrated from the very young ages. So even Islamic schools, what we're trying to create now in the world, where you're teaching the math, science, and English and all of that kind of stuff, and then a class in Islamic studies, of course, yes, it doesn't have any of the soul involved in it, but how are we going to revive Islamic education, starting at that young age, to be able to integrate the body, mind, and soul, so that from that very little age, children don't get disenchanted with Islam. So we see people who put a lot of effort into their children, into their so-called Islamic education, but at the end, by the time they become teenagers, they're still just the typical Western teenager with the scarf, maybe with a little topi or something like that. What are we going to do? I see it a big problem because the people who teach these young children are coming out of universities who've already separated their body, mind, and soul. So if the teachers themselves don't know how to integrate, what are we going to do? How are we going to be, where's the revival point going to start?
Yeah, I think that reminds us that it's not actually primarily about curricula, although they're often very inadequate, but about the teachers. What I remember from my now very distant sort of school years is not really the curriculum, that's all a blur, but I do remember quite clearly some of the teachers. and things that I learnt from them, and things I didn't like and things I did like, things that could inspire me. So even if you have a modern secular nation-state education ministry model where the curriculum is kind of a poor, pathetic imitation of something that happened in the West 50, 60 years ago, you can still create a great classroom environment if the teacher is inspirational and a great personality and tells the kids stories. And in the kind of privacy of the classroom, as it were, all kinds of things can be told to kids, and they can be given not sort of direct preaching, which usually doesn't work, but kind of hikmah and stories and anecdotes, and well, what do you think of this, and why don't we do that, and is it time for prayer, and that sort of thing. And a kind of even one or two inspirational, Islamically aware teachers in a school can produce a whole crop of really great Muslim kids from that school. And similarly, the curriculum can be wonderful, but if the teachers are kind of deadbeat and just interested in what they're going to do at the weekends, the curriculum isn't going to catch fire. So I value this point. It all depends on the educator, and people who go into school teaching are fulfilling an enormously important, pivotal, and inshallah rewarded role in securing the sort of inspiration and the perpetuation of Islam in new generations. And it's really hard work. It's exhausting and soul-destroying, and kids are a problem and becoming more problematic, and the work is excessive. But it's a great risala, it's a great vocation. Probably school teachers have a far greater impact on society than, say, old guys giving khutbahs in mosques occasionally. I think that's the reality. So we should valorize them and give them a way of seeing their vocation as being something that's sacred, a very exalted calling, as it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Shaykh. I've listened to your presentation, trying very hard, because quite high philosophical level. And I look back at the theme when you said that we have lost our reasoning, critical thinking, and love in Islamic education. I was trying to find out the solution that you were trying to prescribe or trying to share with us. And I got confused actually. But anyway, sorry about that. Okay? By the way, going back to the issue of inventing Islamic education, because this is an area which I'm very passionate about. Okay? We have tried many ways to revive, according to what the sisters taught us now, asked us now. We started with realizing our problems as a result of colonization, and we started to talk about integrated education, integrating akal and nakal. Okay? And then we continued on with inculcating values across whatever disciplines of knowledge, this is Islamization of knowledge. And Islamic education is very important for the Muslim, because if you look compared to any other subjects, Islamic education is the one that is taught to all students from grade 1 until grade 12 probably. That means they have at least 12 years of exposition, and yet when you look at the product, the graduates of the school, you don't find the love, and you don't find the reasoning there. So what's wrong? Actually, when I look at it, it's more, I think, towards the methods of teaching. You talk about the teacher just now, that's right. But the teacher's methods and the teacher's personality. And teachers today, they are so much overwhelmed with the pressure to perform academically in the school system, rather than heeding the philosophy of the Islamic education itself. In other words, because of the pressure for achievement of A's, they spend much time on the cognitive domain, so that this student will score an A. But that doesn't reveal the ability to reason and think about the Quran itself. The Quran is not taught for meanings. And there's no sort of ijtihad or deliberation upon the ayat that they read to find out whether they can draw meanings from the ayat. Not just in the university, but also in the secondary school. Or not secondary school, but also the university. And then the same thing, there is nothing about love that is supposed to come out from the teacher. There is no concern about this. This is where the Sufi comes in. So in other words, we have lost both actually. Our Islamic education has lost its soul, it's lost its akal, its mind. So I think, to me, from my own perspective, the teacher and the methods is very important. If we go back to just pure rote memorization, I don't think we will achieve any change. And if we just care about the examination performance, we're not going to achieve anything. Maybe you can give comments on that. And together also, I think you have heard of O'Reilly. He wrote the book called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. And he talked about the theological battles, the rational and reason. And he pinpointed to Al-Ghazali. Now, I know we revere Al-Ghazali so much, but are we going to accept some criticism against Al-Ghazali? Thank you very much.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, and I'm sure I'd agree with much of what you said, which I think is important. And I'm sorry if my presentation was a little bit unclear. I didn't actually get quite to the end of it, but the reason for that was that I realised that if I went on for much longer, you wouldn't have time to rush out and buy my book, and so I stopped. But in any case, thanks everybody for being so attentive and for honouring me with this attention, for coming on a Friday afternoon when many of us would rather be doing other family things. So barakallahu fikum, and I hope for your prayers, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.